What if the oldest libraries on Earth weren't filled with stories but with warnings? What if thousands of clay tablets, hidden beneath collapsing ziggurats and buried cities, weren't mythology at all, but precise documentation of something the Sumerians witnessed, something they feared would happen again? Deep in the ruins of Mesopotamia, archaeologists uncovered records speaking of beings called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. But these weren't vague divine legends. The scribes described them with disturbing specificity, exact hierarchies, defined territories, documented genealogies, and woven throughout every text, every king list, every astronomical tablet, one recurring theme that made scholars uncomfortable. These beings were connected to cycles, to time, to fate, and to return. So before you descend further into this mystery, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're ready for evidence that suggests ancient scribes weren't recording myths. They were recording memories and leaving them as warnings for a future they believed would need them. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Because right now, across this planet, people are discovering the same tablets, reading the same warnings at the exact moment the ancient world may have intended. Tonight we're entering the oldest written archives of human civilization, where gods have job descriptions, where creation myths include engineering details, where astronomical calculations stretch across millennia, where floods that ended worlds can be traced in geological layers, and where every carefully preserved tablet seems to ask one question the scribes never directly answered. What were they trying to make sure we remembered before it was too late? In 1849, a British archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard stood in the ruins of Nineveh, surrounded by what would become one of the most unsettling discoveries in archaeological history. The Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, over 30,000 clay tablets, buried in darkness for over 2,500 years, and as scholars began translating the wedge-shaped script pressed into ancient clay, they realized something disturbing. These weren't myths, they were records, systematic, detailed, methodical. Documentation of beings called the Anunnaki, written with the same administrative precision the scribes used for grain inventories, building projects, and royal genealogies. No mystical flourishes, no poetic embellishment, just names, functions, hierarchies, and most troubling of all, temporal patterns suggesting these beings operated in cycles, not eternities. Picture that moment. Layard and his team, dust-covered in collapsed chambers, carefully extracting tablets that had waited in absolute silence for millennia, each one baked hard as stone under the Mesopotamian sun, each one holding impressions made by hands that believed what they were preserving would matter to someone far in the future, to us. The tablets described kings and wars, yes, but they also described beings who governed cosmic order, who made decisions about humanity's relationship to time, who established systems the scribes seemed desperate to document completely, as if the details mattered, as if forgetting would be dangerous. Here's what made the discovery unsettling. These scribes weren't folklore collectors or religious poets. They were the most rigorously trained professionals in their civilization, educated for years in the complex art of cuneiform, trusted with preserving knowledge that kings and priests considered essential to survival. They were archivists, record keepers, and they approached the Anunnaki the same way they approached everything else they considered real. When they wrote that certain beings controlled specific aspects of cosmic order, they recorded it like bureaucratic registry. When they described councils making decisions about temporal cycles, they documented who attended, what domains they governed, what authority they held. Not as spiritual metaphor, as organizational structure. And then the pattern emerged. As more tablets were translated through the decades, scholars realized the Anunnaki weren't confined to creation myths or religious epics. They appeared everywhere. In king lists tracing authority back through impossible timescales, in astronomical texts calculating celestial movements, in ritual calendars maintaining cosmic alignment, in legal documents establishing divine precedent. They were embedded in every category of Mesopotamian knowledge. The scribes divided their domains with territorial precision: Enki, waters and hidden wisdom; Enlil, air and absolute authority; Ninhursag, the shaping of living forms; Inanna, transformation and sacred conflict; exact, functional, administrative, as if documenting an actual system someone needed to remember how to maintain. But it was the temporal markers scattered throughout the library that created the deepest unease: references to cycles, to ages, to periods measured in astronomical movements; king lists preserving memory across catastrophic breaks in civilization; ritual calendars designed to keep humanity aligned with cosmic patterns. The scribes copied and recopied these across generations with obsessive care. Why? Because they believed someone would need this knowledge when the cycle turned again. The tablets weren't just preserving the past, they were preserving instructions for a future the ancient world believed would face something familiar, something that had happened before, something that would require recognition to survive. The word itself was specific: Anunnaki. Not a poetic title, but a technical classification. In texts dating back to 2600 BC, they appear as a distinct category with clear boundaries separating them from other entities: the Igigi, labourers and servants; the Anunnaki, governors of earth, underworld, fate and cosmic order; supreme authorities above them. The hierarchy was precise, documented, systematic. Those who from heaven to earth came, or princely offspring of An, but the translation matters less than the consistency. Tablet after tablet, seal after seal, century after century. The Anunnaki are described not as invisible spirits, but as entities with defined temporal functions, documented lineages, specific cosmic responsibilities. Temples maintained regular offerings for them, scheduled, ritualized, as if maintaining a relationship with authorities who controlled the cycles everything depended upon. But before we can understand what the Sumerians believed would return, we need to understand exactly who the Anunnaki were in their world. Not through modern interpretation, not through ancient alien speculation, but through the meticulous definitions the scribes themselves preserved, archived and protected across millennia, as if this knowledge was the most dangerous thing to forget. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq, humanity made a decision that would echo across 50 centuries. They chose permanence, not in stone monuments like Egypt, not in oral tradition like the cultures that would vanish without record. The Sumerians chose clay, wet, abundant, soft enough to hold the pressure of a reed stylus, hard enough when baked to survive fire, flood, and the collapse of every empire that would follow them. Imagine standing in ancient Mesopotamia around 3200 BC, watching a scribe press wedge-shaped marks into a palm-sized tablet. The marks aren't decorative, they're not religious art, they're information, compressed into a form designed to outlast the person who wrote it, the king who commissioned it, the city itself. This was writing's birth, not as literature, but as survival technology. The tablets archive everything: trade routes, grain distributions, temple offerings, legal disputes. But threaded through thousands of administrative records, one category appears with disturbing consistency: the Anunnaki. Not mentioned occasionally like distant gods, mentioned systematically the way modern bureaucracies reference governing authorities. They appear in king lists establishing divine legitimacy, in astronomical texts calculating celestial authority, in ritual calendars maintaining cosmic alignment, in texts copied and recopied across generations as if the details could never be allowed to fade. The scribes categorize them meticulously: Anu, supreme authority of heaven; Enlil, lord of the air and command; Enki, master of subterranean waters and secret knowledge; Ninhursag, shaper of living forms; Inanna, force of transformation and sacred conflict. Not vague spiritual concepts, but named entities with defined responsibilities, documented relationships, territorial divisions precise enough to suggest someone was preserving an organizational chart. Meanwhile, long before anyone listening tonight was born, these tablets were already ancient. By the time Babylon rose, Sumerian was a dead language, preserved only by priests and scholars who copied texts they could barely understand. But they kept copying, as if interrupting the chain would be catastrophic. And here's what made archaeologists uncomfortable when they finally translated the archives. The Anunnaki aren't just associated with power or creation, they're associated with time itself, with cycles, with astronomical periods marking ages, with moments when cosmic order shifts, ends, or returns to an earlier configuration. The texts don't explain why this matters. They simply document it, preserve it, protect it across millennia, with the same urgency they use for flood warnings and famine preparations. If the Sumerians believed some knowledge had to survive disaster, what kind of future were they preparing for? The Sumerians had 17 different words for temple officials, 32 terms for different types of priests, but only one word for the beings who governed cosmic order: Anunnaki. That specificity matters. In ancient Sumerian, the term breaks down as Anunnaki, roughly translating to offspring of Anu, or those who from heaven to earth came. But translation only tells us how the word was built, not why it appeared in nearly every category of official record the Sumerians maintained. Legal contracts invoke them as witnesses. Astronomical texts track their celestial associations. King lists traced royal authority back through their lineages. Temple inventories documented daily offerings made to them, not as symbolic gestures but as scheduled obligations. They weren't fringe deities worshipped in obscure rural shrines. They were woven into the administrative backbone of civilization itself. Here's where the texts become uncomfortable. The Anunnaki were never described as creators of the universe. That role belonged to older, more distant entities. Instead, the Anunnaki functioned as governors, judges, administrators of an order that already existed. Enlil didn't create air, he commanded it. Enki didn't invent water, he regulated its flow and guarded the knowledge hidden beneath it. Ninhursag didn't originate life, she shaped and refined living forms according to established patterns. The distinction is subtle but persistent across thousands of tablets. Meanwhile, the text carefully differentiated them from other divine categories. The Igigi were labourers, servants, and beings who performed tasks under Anunnaki authority. Local city gods like Marduk of Babylon or Ningirsu of Lagash governed specific territories but answered to broader cosmic hierarchies. The Anunnaki stood between these local powers and supreme authorities, occupying a functional middle tier that managed the mechanics of cosmic order. But here's the detail that changes everything. In the earliest king lists, Sumerian rulers didn't just claim divine favour, they claimed direct descent from Anunnaki lineages, as if kingship itself was a genetic inheritance passed through bloodlines that crossed between divine and human realms. The texts don't present this metaphorically, they record it genealogically, with the same precision used for documenting trade agreements and property transfers. And the repetition creates its own disturbing rhythm. Tablet after tablet, century after century, the Anunnaki appear in contexts tied to three specific concepts: cosmic order, temporal cycles, and judgment over humanity's relationship to both. Why were beings tied to cosmic order also connected to time, fate, and judgment? The Sumerians didn't have a word for progress. Their absence tells us something fundamental about how they understood existence. While modern civilization measures time as a line stretching from past toward future, Sumerian scribes recorded time as wheels within wheels, cycles rotating at different speeds, all returning to positions they had occupied before. Their calendar wasn't designed to count forward, it was designed to repeat. Every month began with the new moon. every year realigned with lunar cycles through added intercalary months. Festival dates returned on schedule, not as anniversaries of past events, but as moments when cosmic conditions repeated themselves. The Akitu festival, celebrating New Year, wasn't commemorating the first New Year. It was reenacting the original establishment of order, as if time itself needed to be reset, reauthorized, confirmed again. The texts describe this with administrative precision. Rituals weren't symbolic. They were maintenance, cosmic alignments that required regular human participation to keep cycles functioning correctly. And the Anunnaki were recorded as the authorities who determined when these alignments occurred, who judged whether balance had been maintained, who decided if disruption required intervention. But here's the pattern. Modern historians struggle to categorize. Mesopotamian civilization experienced repeated catastrophic collapses, floods, invasions, dynasties that vanished overnight. And rather than treating these as random disasters, the Sumerians recorded them as cyclical events, moments when ages ended and new ages began, separated by resets that destroyed what came before but allowed cosmic order to continue. The king lists document this explicitly. Kingship descended from heaven. Then the flood came, then kingship descended again. The phrasing suggests interruption and restoration, not continuous development. As if authority itself operated in cycles, present during certain ages, absent during others, returning when conditions aligned. If time itself was believed to repeat, what was meant to return with it? One document survived longer than any Sumerian city. The king list. It's not a single tablet. It's a text copied and recopied across centuries by scribes who preserved it with obsessive precision, even as empires rose and collapsed around them. The list documents rulers stretching back before recorded history, before the flood, before what the Sumerians considered the current age of the world. And the numbers are impossible. Early kings are recorded with reigns lasting thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Al-Algar ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings spanning 241,200 years total. Then, the text states simply, the flood swept over. After the flood, the numbers drop. Reigns become centuries, then decades, then historically plausible lengths that align with archaeological evidence. Modern scholars treat the early figures as symbolic, mythological inflation meant to convey antiquity and divine authority. But that interpretation misses what the text is actually preserving. The list isn't about the numbers, it's about continuity. And notice the structure. Before the flood, kingship existed. The flood destroyed everything. After the flood, the text states, kingship descended from heaven once again. Not established for the first time, descended again, restored. Returned to a pattern that had existed before catastrophe interrupted it. The Sumerians weren't recording how long kings lived. They were documenting that authority itself survived destruction, that cosmic order persisted across what should have been total erasure. The list bridges an apocalypse, treating pre-flood and post-flood eras as part of a single unbroken timeline, as if memory itself could outlast the end of the world. And here's what creates unease. Later, Mesopotamian scribes, writing in Akkadian and Babylonian, kept copying the Sumerian text long after Sumerian was a dead language. They preserved king names they couldn't fully translate, maintaining a chain of memory reaching back to rulers from a world they believed had been destroyed. Why preserve a memory of rulers from a world believed to have ended? Spoken words vanished the moment they left the mouth. The Sumerians understood this with uncomfortable clarity, so they invented permanence. Becoming a scribe in ancient Mesopotamia required years of training in temple schools called eduba, tablet houses. Students spent childhood memorizing hundreds of cuneiform signs, practicing on cheap clay that could be smoothed and reused until their hands achieved the precision required for permanent records. Only then were they trusted with tablets destined for archives, tablets that would be baked hard, sealed in clay envelopes, and stored in temple libraries designed to survive fire and flood. This wasn't education, it was transmission training. The tablets themselves reveal the obsession. Many include colophons, small inscriptions at the end identifying the text as a copy of an older tablet, which itself was copied from something earlier. Scribes noted when source tablets were damaged, when sections were illegible, when they were copying texts in languages they barely understood. They preserved the gaps, the uncertainties, as if accuracy mattered more than comprehension. Why copy what you can't fully read? Because the Sumerian scribes believed writing wasn't for their present. It was for whoever came after. Tablets were archived in sequences, catalogued by subject, protected in dedicated chambers. Libraries weren't collections of literature. They were time capsules, information compressed into clay and fired into a form that could outlast stone, outlast bronze, outlast the civilizations that created them. And threaded through these archives, one category received disproportionate preservation effort: texts involving the Anunnaki. Hymns to them were copied more frequently than other religious material. King lists tracing authority through their genealogies were duplicated across cities. Astronomical tables tracking their celestial associations were updated, corrected, maintained across centuries, as if these particular records carried weight beyond historical interest. The texts described the Anunnaki as authorities over tablets of destiny, cosmic records determining fates. But perhaps the metaphor worked both directions. If divine beings kept eternal records, then human scribes keeping permanent records participated in something sacred, something that transcended individual lifetimes. If writing was meant to survive civilizations, who did the scribes believe would read it next? The Mesopotamian priest astronomers could predict eclipses centuries in advance, not through divine revelation, through mathematics. By 1800 BC, Babylonian astronomers had identified the Saros cycle, a period of 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours, after which eclipses repeat in nearly identical patterns. They tracked Venus with precision, sufficient to calculate its synodic period within hours of modern measurements. They documented planetary conjunctions, lunar phases, stellar risings with obsessive detail spanning generations, in creating prediction tables that allowed them to know when celestial events would occur long before anyone alive would witness them. This created a disturbing cognitive situation. The future became knowable. Temple archives contained astronomical diaries, recording observations night after night for centuries. These weren't mystical texts. They were data tables, numerical sequences tracking celestial mechanics, with the same administrative rigor applied to grain storage. And from these patterns, astronomer priests could state with certainty what the sky would look like on specific dates decades hence. But here's where prediction merged with theology. Each planet, each constellation, each celestial phenomenon was associated with specific Anunnaki. Venus belonged to Inanna, Jupiter to Marduk, Saturn to Ninurta. The movements of celestial bodies weren't random. They reflected divine activities, cosmic decisions being enacted across the sky where humanity could observe, track, and anticipate them. The texts describe this explicitly. Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive compendium of celestial omens, contains over 7,000 entries connecting astronomical observations to terrestrial consequences. Not as superstition, but as correlation between celestial order and earthly events, both governed by the same authorities operating on calculable schedules. And here's the detail that breaks conventional interpretation. The Mesopotamians didn't distinguish sharply between prediction and memory. Their verb forms treated future certainty and past events with similar grammatical structures, as if knowing something would happen made it functionally equivalent to remembering it had already occurred. To minds thinking in eternal cycles, perhaps the future wasn't approaching. Perhaps it was returning. If the future could be calculated, did it already exist in some form? Beneath the ruins of Ur, archaeologists found a layer of clean river clay 8 feet thick. No pottery, no tools, no evidence of human habitation. Just sterile sediment separating 2 distinct civilizations, as if time itself had been interrupted by water and silence. This wasn't unique to Ur. Similar flood layers appear at Uruk, Kish, Shuruppak, Lagash. Not simultaneous, geological analysis reveals, but recurring across centuries. Mesopotamia experienced catastrophic flooding repeatedly, the Tigris and Euphrates breaking their banks, submerging cities, erasing settlements, forcing survivors to rebuild on top of what the water had buried, and the Sumerians remembered. The Epic of Atrahasis describes it with disturbing clarity. Humanity had grown too numerous, too noisy. The gods, led by Enlil, convened a council. The decision was made: reduce the population through catastrophe. Flood would accomplish what plague and famine had failed to complete. But Enki, master of subterranean waters, warned one man, instructing him to build a vessel, preserve life, survive what was coming. Notice the structure. This wasn't divine caprice, it was cosmic recalibration, a deliberate reset executed after consultation, debate, dissent. The Anunnaki Council functioned administratively, weighing options, making decisions about humanity's relationship to cosmic order, then implementing solutions through natural forces they controlled. The flood wasn't punishment, it was correction. Imagine the water rising, slow at first, then relentless, fields disappearing, mud brick walls dissolving, temple platforms becoming islands, then submerging entirely. Silence replacing the sounds of cities, markets, rituals. Everything humanity had built, erased beneath brown water that stretched to every horizon, reflecting nothing but sky. And then, recession. Mud emerging. Land reappearing. Survivors descending from highlands or stepping from vessels onto ground that looked familiar but felt fundamentally altered. The world before the flood had ended. What came after was new, even if built in the same river valley, using the same clay, speaking the same language. But here's what creates deeper unease. The myths don't describe the flood as unique. Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim recounts the deluge, includes a detail modern readers often miss. After describing the flood's devastation, Utnapishtim mentions earlier destructions, prior moments when the gods had reduced humanity. The flood was the most recent reset, not the only one. The Sumerian worldview absorbed catastrophe as cyclical inevitability. Cities fell, dynasties ended, populations collapsed. Then rebuilding began, not as tragic recovery, but as expected continuation, as if cosmic order included periodic destruction as a maintenance function. And the Anunnaki remained. Kings changed. Cities rose and fell. Languages evolved. But the authorities governing cosmic cycles persisted across every reset. Mentioned in text before the flood, documented in archives after it, as if they operated on temporal scales that made human civilization a brief repeating pattern they observed from outside. The geological evidence confirms what the myths preserve. Mesopotamian civilization experienced multiple catastrophic interruptions. Archaeological layers show abandonment, flooding, rebuilding. The Sumerian king list divides history at the flood. Later Babylonian chronicles reference earlier disruptions. Memory of ending and beginning again was woven into cultural identity at the deepest level. If the world had ended before and begun again, why couldn't it happen once more? The Sumerians didn't fear the return, they prepared for it. This distinction matters more than it seems. Across Mesopotamian texts, references to return appear not as apocalyptic warnings, but as statements of cosmic rhythm. Order departed during disruption. Balance would be restored when conditions aligned. The Anunnaki, as governors of these cycles, would reassert authority when temporal patterns completed their rotations. But return of what exactly? The texts never describe beings descending from ships or arriving from distant locations. Instead, they reference the restoration of me, a Sumerian concept without direct English translation. Me were divine decrees, cosmic principles, cultural foundations, the fundamental patterns by which civilization functioned. When texts mention return, they're describing the re-establishment of me after periods of chaos. The realignment of human society with cosmic order after disruption had thrown everything out of balance. The Babylonian Enuma Elish describes this process. After defeating Tiamat and establishing current cosmic order, Marduk assigns the Anunnaki their stations, their responsibilities, their roles in maintaining the system. But the text implies this wasn't the first time such organization had occurred. The language suggests restoration, not innovation, as if cosmic order had existed before, collapsed, and was being reconstructed according to patterns that predated even the gods involved. And here's where Mesopotamian thought connects to broader ancient worldviews. Egyptian cosmology describes cycles of creation and dissolution, ages separated by periods of chaos before Ma'at, cosmic order, was restored. Hindu texts detailed yugas, vast time cycles where Dharma declined and was periodically re-established. Or Greek philosophy explored eternal return, the idea that cosmic patterns repeated across incomprehensible timescales. These weren't borrowed concepts. They emerged independently across civilizations that observed the same patterns. Empires rose and fell. Knowledge was lost and rediscovered. Order gave way to chaos before stability returned. The ancient world didn't interpret these patterns as random. They saw cycles, rhythms, cosmic mechanics, operating on scales beyond individual human experience but observable across generations. The Mesopotamian contribution was precision. While other cultures described cycles philosophically, Sumerian and Babylonian scribes attempted to calculate them. Astronomical tables tracked planetary returns. King lists measured dynastic cycles. Ritual calendars maintained alignment with cosmic periods. The return wasn't mystical prophecy, it was mathematical inevitability. But notice what's missing from these texts. The Anunnaki themselves don't return. Their authority returns. Their order returns. The patterns they established reassert themselves after periods of disruption. The texts describe cosmic realignment, not divine reappearance. This suggests something unsettling about Mesopotamian theology. Perhaps the Anunnaki were never understood as beings who came and went, but as eternal authorities whose influence waxed and waned according to humanity's relationship with cosmic order. When civilization aligned with me, divine authority was present, manifest, effective. When humanity fell into chaos, that connection weakened, fragmented, disappeared. Return then wasn't about beings descending. It was about reconnection, realignment, the restoration of a relationship between human civilization and cosmic patterns that had always existed but required conscious maintenance. The later Babylonian text Era and Ishum describes this explicitly. When cosmic order breaks down, when rituals cease, when knowledge is forgotten, the gods withdraw. Not to distant locations, but into dormancy, inactivity, waiting for conditions that would make their authority effective again. And restoration required human action, ritual performance, knowledge preservation, the deliberate reconstruction of alignment. Was the return something external, or something humanity itself would bring about? The tablets weren't warning about visitors, they were warning about forgetting. This realization emerges slowly when you step back from individual texts and observe the pattern of what the Sumerians chose to preserve. Not adventure stories, not entertainment, not even primarily religious devotion. What they baked into clay, archived in temple libraries, and copied across centuries was knowledge about cycles, about cosmic order, about the relationship between human civilization and patterns larger than any individual lifetime could contain. The warning pressed into clay was structural, not supernatural. Consider what we've traced. Writing invented not for poetry, but for permanence. king lists preserving memory across catastrophic breaks, astronomical tables calculating celestial returns centuries in advance, ritual calendars maintaining alignment with cosmic cycles, flood narratives describing destruction as reset, or as not ending, and threaded through everything the Anunnaki, not as characters in stories, but as symbolic authorities representing cosmic order itself, the patterns that governed time, fate, and the consequences of human choices. The Sumerians observed something fundamental. Civilizations forget. Knowledge erodes. Connections between human activity and cosmic patterns weaken. And when memory fails, when alignment breaks, catastrophe follows. Not as divine punishment, but as natural consequence. The way crops fail when planting cycles are ignored. The way floods devastate when water management collapses. So they built a defense system. Not walls or weapons, but archives. Every copied tablet was an act of resistance against forgetting. Every preserved king list maintained continuity across disruption. Every astronomical calculation kept humanity connected to celestial patterns. The scribes weren't just recording the past. They were creating anchors, reference points future generations could use to recognize where they stood in larger cycles, to understand that what seemed unprecedented had occurred before, that patterns repeated when wisdom was lost, and the Anunnaki in this framework weren't beings who would return. They were principles that needed to be remembered. Enki, master of deep waters and hidden knowledge, represented the understanding that wisdom requires effort to access, that surface appearances conceal deeper truths. Enlil, lord of air and authority, embodied the recognition that cosmic order operates whether humans acknowledge it or not. Ninhursag, shaper of living forms, Assassin, symbolized the truth that creation follows patterns, not randomness. Inanna, force of transformation and conflict, acknowledged that change and disruption were fundamental to existence, not aberrations. These weren't personalities to worship, they were cosmic realities to align with. But here's the detail that reframes everything. The texts suggest this alignment was optional. Humans could maintain connection to cosmic order through ritual, knowledge preservation, astronomical observation, moral alignment. Or they could disconnect, forget, ignore the patterns, assume their immediate experience represented all of reality. The Anunnaki didn't enforce consequences. The universe did. Disconnection from cosmic order produced its own results. The way ignoring seasons produces famine. The way dismissing flood cycles produces disaster. The warning then was about choice, not fate imposed from outside, but consequences emerging from within. Humanity could choose to remember cycles, maintain alignment, preserve knowledge, or choose to forget, disconnect, rebuild the same mistakes until the next reset. And the Sumerians, witnessing repeated collapses, watching cities fall and rise and fall again, understood something we're still learning. The greatest threat to civilization isn't external invasion, it's internal amnesia. The moment a culture believes it has transcended patterns that governed previous ages, the moment it assumes its knowledge is complete, its systems permanent, its understanding final, that's the moment disconnection begins. Writing was their solution. Not perfect, but persistent. Clay tablets couldn't prevent catastrophe. Nay, but they could preserve the memory that catastrophe had occurred before, that recovery was possible, that patterns repeated. The tablets were messages, yes, but not warnings about what was coming. They were reminders about what had already happened, what would happen again if the same mistakes were repeated, what could be avoided if memory remained intact. The Anunnaki, in this understanding, were guardians not because they protected humanity from outside threats, but because they represented the cosmic principles that, when remembered and aligned with, protected civilization from its own cyclical tendency toward forgetting. Tonight, sitting with this knowledge, we face the same choice the ancient scribes faced. We can preserve what we've learned, maintain connection to patterns larger than our immediate experience, Recognize that our moment is one point in cycles we didn't create and can't control but can align with. Or we can assume our age is unprecedented, our knowledge complete, our systems permanent, and wait for the patterns to reassert themselves the way they always have. The Sumerian tablets still exist. Baked clay outlasted bronze, outlasted empires, outlasted the language that created it. The warning survived, not because gods preserved it, but because scribes chose permanence over convenience, future memory over present ease. If the ancient world believed everything returns when memory is lost, what are we choosing to remember tonight?